Attention is not infinite. It is, in fact, one of the most precious and limited neural resources we possess. The human brain is constantly bombarded with signals: visual, auditory, emotional, social, but only a fraction of that input can actually be processed consciously. That's because the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for focus, decision-making, and goal-directed behavior, has a very narrow bandwidth. It can't hold much at once. And every time you switch tasks or get pulled into something irrelevant, you're not just pausing your focus, you're bleeding energy. From a neuroscience standpoint, attention is metabolically expensive. It burns glucose. It recruits multiple brain networks, frontal, parietal, even subcortical systems that have to work in harmony to sustain a single line of thought. So when you're in a state of fragmented attention, checking messages, scanning headlines, clicking from one thing to the next, you're triggering a cascade of neural switching, and that switching is not free. It comes with a biological cost: reduced depth of processing, lower memory retention, increased mental fatigue. What's even more concerning is that the brain adapts to fragmentation. The more you feed it novelty and distraction, the more it craves it. You literally reinforce the circuitry that favors superficial engagement over deep work. The dopaminergic system becomes calibrated not to focus, but to seek. This is why people often feel scattered or mentally cloudy. They've trained their brains to prioritize the next hit of information over sustained clarity. But the reverse is also true. You can train your attention, you can sculpt it just like you would a muscle when you engage in practices that require deep focus. Reading a dense paragraph, writing a single sentence with intention, or holding your gaze on one visual point. You're strengthening the neural pathways that support cognitive endurance. You're boosting the release of acetylcholine in particular, a neurochemical that sharpens attention at the cellular level. It acts like a spotlight in the brain, increasing the signal-to-noise ratio, making the important information stand out while suppressing the irrelevant. And here's where silence comes in. Silence acts as a recovery protocol. In the absence of input, your brain reclaims resources, your nervous system enters a parasympathetic state, your attentional system, no longer pulled in a dozen directions, begins to stabilize. This creates the space necessary for strategic thought and mental clarity. It creates the conditions where intention, not reaction, becomes the driving force of your behavior. So when you eliminate distractions, when you stop responding to every buzz, every pop-up, every trivial conversation, you are not just gaining time, you are reclaiming your neural capital. You're telling your brain what matters, and over time, it listens, it rewires. It learns to hold focus, to stay with the task, to resist the pull of noise. That's not just a psychological shift. That's a physiological transformation, one that leads to real, sustainable self-mastery. When we speak about silence, we're not just referring to the absence of noise. We're talking about a specific neurophysiological state, one in which the brain isn't reacting to external stimuli, but instead turns inward. In those moments, a particular set of brain regions becomes more active. This is known as the default mode network, or DMN. It includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and parts of the parietal lobe. This network becomes dominant when you're not focused on the outside world, when you're daydreaming, remembering the past, simulating the future, or engaging in self-reflection. And what's fascinating is that the default mode network is not idle. It's deeply active, but its activity is directed inward rather than outward. When silence surrounds you, true silence, without notifications, without dialogue, without background input, your brain shifts modes. It enters a state where it starts processing you, your thoughts, your values, your decisions, your emotional patterns. This is where insight This is where you recognize behaviors you've been repeating unconsciously. This is where you start to make meaning from experience rather than simply accumulating it. From a control standpoint, this network is essential. It allows for metacognition, thinking about thinking. It's what helps you pause before reacting, reflect on past errors, visualize better outcomes, and make more strategic choices. But this capacity is suppressed when your brain is constantly being forced into what's called task-positive mode, responding to external demands, jumping from one alert to another, grinding through to-do lists without context or depth. Studies using functional MRI show that people who engage in regular silence, especially in the form of reflection, meditation, or even walks without devices, have stronger connectivity within the DMN. That connectivity translates to greater self-awareness, better emotional regulation, and improved decision-making. Why? Because the brain is practicing internal organization. It's strengthening its ability to monitor itself. That's the root of control. Not willpower, but awareness followed by intentional redirection. Silence is not passive. It's a form of neural training. It gives the brain a chance to simulate future possibilities without consequence, to process emotional experiences without judgment, to rehearse decisions without action. That rehearsal process, especially when it's done in silence, reduces the cognitive load when the real moment arrives. You're no longer just reacting, you're executing something you've already mentally prepared for. This is why some of the most mentally disciplined individuals across different fields build silence into their daily rhythm. It's not because they're avoiding the world, it's because they're refining their internal model of it. They're shaping their reactions before the world provokes them. And neurologically, what they're doing is exercising the DMN, enhancing their ability to stay grounded, centered, and in control, even under pressure. So when you choose silence, you're not stepping back, you're stepping in. You're training the systems responsible for self-awareness, long-term planning, and emotional precision. That is not withdrawal. That is power built quietly. Focus isn't just a mental choice. It's a biochemical process. It's chemistry first, then cognition. At the core of sustained attention and deep mental clarity are three key neuromodulators: dopamine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. When these systems are activated in balance and with specificity, they create the ideal neural environment for focus. But this isn't something you're either born with or not. These chemicals are trainable. You can shape their release through behavior, environment, and intentional practice. Let's start with dopamine. This molecule is often misunderstood as the molecule of pleasure. That's only partly true. Dopamine is really about motivation, the drive to pursue a goal. When you anticipate a meaningful outcome, your brain releases dopamine, especially in areas like the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. That release tells your brain, this is worth doing, stay with it. Dopamine also sharpens the signal between neurons, allowing you to lock onto the task and filter out distractions. But here's the key. Dopamine release is highly sensitive to novelty and reward expectation. That means the way you frame your focus and how you mentally tag a task as valuable directly affects your ability to stay engaged. Norepinephrine, on the other hand, is all about alertness. It's released from the locus ceruleus, a small nucleus in the brainstem, and it acts like a spotlight. It heightens sensory processing, enhances vigilance, and increases the readiness of your entire nervous system. You need norepinephrine to stay awake, to scan your environment, and to respond quickly, but too much of it leads to hypervigilance, anxiety, restlessness, inability to lock in. So balance matters. This is where breathing, visual anchoring, and posture come into play. Subtle shifts in physiology regulate norepinephrine and help fine-tune your focus state. Then there's acetylcholine. This is the most precision-driven of the three. While dopamine and norepinephrine set the stage, motivation and arousal, acetylcholine marks the target. It's released in the basal forebrain and acts directly on the cortical neurons involved in attention. Think of it like a laser pointer. It helps the brain say, this is what matters, ignore the rest. You can train acetylcholine release by repeatedly returning your attention to a single object, thought, or task without judgment. Every redirection strengthens the circuits responsible for attentional control. Now, here's the critical insight. These neuromodulators are under voluntary influence. You can drive their release by what you choose to attend to and how you attend to it. Visual fixation, locking your gaze on a single point, can stimulate norepinephrine. Goal framing, reminding yourself why a task matters, can increase dopamine. And single point concentration, even for short periods, enhances acetylcholine signaling. The takeaway is this: focus is not luck. It's not talent. It's a trainable neurochemical skill. You build it the same way you build strength or endurance, with consistency, deliberate effort, and respect for the underlying biology. When you understand the chemistry, you stop fighting your brain and start working with it. That's when real clarity begins. In today's world, overstimulation is the norm. Our sensory systems, visual, auditory, even emotional, are under constant assault. Bright screens, urgent messages, background noise, traffic, nonstop conversation. Most people exist in a baseline state of arousal that borders on neurological exhaustion. The nervous system wasn't designed for this level of sustained input. And when it happens chronically, stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline begin to shape the brain in ways that erode clarity, focus, and emotional control. And here what we know from the biology. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid released by the adrenal glands in response to perceived threat. In small, acute doses, it sharpens the senses and readies the body to act. But when that response becomes chronic, triggered by everything from deadlines to notifications, it begins to dysregulate key brain regions. The hippocampus, responsible for memory consolidation, becomes less efficient. The prefrontal cortex, the center of focus and planning, starts to lose its precision. And the amygdala, your emotional alarm system, becomes hyperreactive. You feel wired, tired, easily distracted, and emotionally volatile. That's not just stress. That's neurochemical imbalance caused by overstimulation. Now, silence acts as a countermeasure, a recalibration mechanism. When you enter a silent environment, no voices, no phones, no demands, you remove the external cues that keep your stress system activated. Your sensory input drops, your heart rate slows, and this triggers a shift in your autonomic nervous system from sympathetic fight or flight to parasympathetic rest and restore. In this state, cortisol begins to drop, adrenaline levels decline, blood flow shifts back to the prefrontal cortex, allowing rational reflective thinking to resume. What's even more compelling is the impact on neural regeneration. Animal studies show that exposure to silence, even as little as 2 hours per day, can stimulate the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus. This is neurogenesis in response to stillness, a direct biological link between quiet environments and cognitive restoration. And while the effect in humans is more complex, we see parallel results in functional imaging studies. After periods of intentional silence, brain networks involved in memory, attention, and emotional regulation begin to restabilize. Connectivity improves, mental energy returns. It's important to understand that silence is not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of input. That includes cognitive input, no conversation, no podcasts, no multitasking, just space. Space for the brain to downshift, space for the nervous system to repair. In that state, the brain is not doing less, it's actually doing the foundational maintenance work it can't do under pressure. And the more frequently you create those silent intervals, the more resilient your system becomes. You're not just reducing stress. You're building capacity, the capacity to focus longer, to regulate emotion faster, to return to equilibrium more effectively after being thrown off course. Silence, then, is not a luxury or an escape. It's a biological tool, a reset switch embedded in our evolution. You just have to be disciplined enough to press it. Human beings are wired for connection. Our nervous systems evolved to detect and respond to the emotions, intentions, and actions of others. At the center of this capacity is a network of cells called mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action. But they don't just mirror movement. They mirror emotion, tone, tension, facial expressions. This is what allows us to empathize, to intuit, to read a room without a single word being spoken. But this same mechanism that makes empathy possible also makes us vulnerable. Mirror neurons don't filter. They don't ask if what we're absorbing is healthy, helpful, or aligned with our own values. They just reflect. So if you're around anxious people, you begin to feel anxious. If you're surrounded by stress, anger, gossip, or constant urgency, those emotional states begin to imprint on your nervous system, often without your awareness. This is emotional contagion. It's real, it's fast, and it's happening all the time. Your brain is syncing up with the people around you through tone of voice, posture, eye movements, even micro expressions. And if you're not careful, your internal state stops being your own. You're no longer driving your emotional experience. You're just reacting to whatever is present in your environment. That's not self-mastery. That's entrainment. Now, here's where silence becomes incredibly powerful. When you enter silence, true silence, not just the absence of speech, but the absence of social input, you begin to break the loop. You give your nervous system a chance to return to baseline. Without someone else's energy bouncing off you, the mirror neuron system can down-regulate. It's like stepping out of a room full of mirrors and finally seeing your own reflection clearly without distortion. So silence also gives you space to observe. Observation is different from absorption. Observation activates the prefrontal cortex, allowing you to evaluate, reflect, and choose how you respond. Absorption bypasses that system. It's automatic. And in overstimulating environments, especially emotionally charged ones, absorption dominates. Silence reverses that. It re-engages choice. It puts you back in the driver's seat of your own nervous system. And this doesn't mean withdrawing from people or relationships. It means cultivating discernment, choosing when to engage, when to absorb, and when to retreat. It means protecting your emotional bandwidth so that you're not constantly syncing with energy that undermines your clarity, peace, or purpose. And when you practice regular silence, even just a few minutes each day, you're not isolating yourself. You're building emotional independence. You're allowing the mirror neuron system to rest, reset, and return to its natural, responsive, not reactive state. That's how you stop being a sponge and start being a filter. That's how you go from emotional vulnerability to emotional precision. And from there, you can engage the world not as a reflection of it, but as a centered, self-directed force within it. In a world conditioned for immediacy, the ability to pause, to not react, is one of the most powerful neural adaptations you can build. Reactivity is fast, emotional, and often unconscious. It's governed by older parts of the brain, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the periaqueductal gray. These regions evolved for survival, not strategy. They're efficient when threat is real and imminent. But in modern life, most threats are not physical. They're psychological, social, emotional, and reacting to everything as if it's life or death creates a brain state dominated by chaos, not clarity. Here's what happens neurologically when you react impulsively. The amygdala detects a perceived threat, someone's tone, a message, a disagreement, and it signals the hypothalamus to initiate a stress response. Cortisol and adrenaline surge, blood diverts from the prefrontal cortex, and your cognitive flexibility collapses. You become more rigid, more defensive, more tunnel-visioned. In that state, you're not thinking, you're surviving. But the opposite, not reacting, activates a different set of neural circuits. When you pause, observe, and delay response, you give the prefrontal cortex time to come online. And this part of the brain is involved in regulation, decision-making, and social cognition. It allows you to assess context, weigh consequences, and choose from a wider set of behavioral responses. Every time you practice that pause, you are reinforcing the connection between the prefrontal cortex and subcortical regions like the amygdala. That connection is literal. It strengthens, it becomes faster, more efficient. This is how resilience is built, not through suppression, but through regulation. In fact, studies in neuroplasticity show that choosing not to react in emotionally charged situations enhances what's known as top-down control. This refers to the brain's ability to modulate emotional responses through conscious cortical input. The more you exercise that control, the more automatic it becomes. You're not just behaving differently, you're wiring yourself for stability under pressure. Silence plays a key role here. Silence creates the conditions necessary for that pause to exist. It removes the expectation of immediate response. It quiets the stimulus-response loop just long enough for intention to enter. In that gap between stimulus and response is where your neural resilience is trained. And resilience isn't about being unaffected. It's about being non-fragile. It's about maintaining internal order in the face of external chaos. When you train your brain to not react, to take the hit of discomfort, emotion, or provocation and stay centered, you're conditioning your nervous system to handle stress without collapse. You're telling your biology, we don't respond to everything we choose. Over time, that choice becomes habit, and that habit becomes your default mode under fire. This isn't avoidance, it's mastery. It's the difference between being run by your environment and running your own system. You're not pushing things down, you're observing them, holding space for them, and deciding when and how to act. That's not weakness, that's control, built breath by breath, in the silence between reaction and response. Self-mastery isn't a personality trait. It's not something you're born with. It's a system, a set of neural circuits trained to prioritize clarity over chaos, strategy over impulse, and awareness over reactivity. And like any system, it requires structured input to grow. That input doesn't come from noise, stimulation, or constant feedback. It comes from solitude. Intentional solitude, not isolation, not escape, a deliberate decision to step away from external demands in order to refine the internal ones. Inside the brain, self-mastery is reflected in the precision of cortical processing. The prefrontal cortex is constantly weighing options, anticipating outcomes, suppressing distractions, and aligning actions with values. But that alignment can only happen when the signal-to-noise ratio is clean, when your own thoughts aren't being drowned out by everyone else's. That's what intentional solitude provides, a context in which you can actually hear yourself think, and more importantly, a context in which you can watch yourself think, observe your mental habits, patterns, and loops. In solitude, the brain enters a different operating state. You're not just offloading data, you're integrating. Memory consolidation improves, emotional processing deepens, long-range planning becomes more accessible, and you begin to ask better questions. What am I really working toward? What behavior patterns keep repeating? What internal narratives need to be challenged, edited, or released? This isn't about positive thinking, it's about neurological refinement. You're identifying the internal noise, rumination, distraction, emotional clutter, and filtering it out. That's how you build internal precision. And the more precise your inner world becomes, the more mastery you exert over your outer world. You respond faster, you recover quicker, you don't overreach, over-explain, or overreact. You start making choices from alignment, not anxiety. Now here's what's often missed. Solitude is not passive. It's active engagement with the self. It's mental resistance training. The moment you remove external stimulation, your brain starts reaching for it. That's normal, but sitting through that restlessness, watching it without feeding it, conditions the circuits responsible for impulse control. That's the same circuitry you rely on in moments of real stress. So solitude isn't just about reflection, it's about preparation. Over time, intentional solitude sharpens identity. When you strip away other people's voices, you start hearing your own. You get clearer on what you value, not what you're told to value. You recognize which goals are genuine and which are borrowed. You stop chasing validation and start creating direction. That direction becomes the backbone of self-mastery, the ability to hold course even when things are loud, fast, or uncertain. Ultimately, what solitude gives you is distance from noise, from chaos, and even from your own conditioned reactions. And in that distance, you find leverage. You stop living in reaction loops and start building intentional systems. You become less volatile, more stable, less driven by urgency, more driven by aim. That's self-mastery. Not as a concept, but as a trained, earned neural state, built quietly in the hours no one sees. The mind is not a chaotic force to be feared or silenced. It's a system to be understood, trained, and refined. Through focus, silence, non-reactivity, and solitude, we aren't escaping life. We're learning to interface with it on our own terms. Every time you choose stillness over noise, intention over reaction, you're shifting your brain toward clarity, resilience, and mastery. These aren't abstract ideals, they are biological realities accessible through practice and discipline. We don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. And when those systems are built from within, with precision and patience, they hold strong under pressure. You begin to navigate life not with scattered energy, but with anchored presence. Not trying to control everything around you, but mastering what's within you. That's not just mental strength, it's neural sovereignty, and it's built moment by moment in silence.